So you've had the presentation from Claudio, which is an important setup into the technology and the characteristics of CRRT. And the next question is, if you choose to use CRRT and you've made that commitment, there are a variety of modalities of CRRT that you need to consider, and it's important to understand the principles of all of them and to understand the evidence that's available in order to guide your choice of CRRT modality. So let's start by trying to go through some of the key principles about what we do. So this is a typical circuit of continuous veno-venous hemofiltration, or CVVH, and it has two different approaches to the administration of replacement fluid. One is pre-filter and one is post-filter. So if you choose to do CVVH as your modality of choice, then there is another question you need to address, is whether you're going to use pre-dilution or whether you're going to use post-dilution. So in order to make that decision, you need to understand some of the concepts. If you give pre-dilution, you're going to prevent the inevitable hemoconcentration that would happen if you didn't do that. And that prevents the increase in hematocrit, platelet count, clotting factors concentration in the filter as you remove the fluid in order to achieve the clearance that you wish to achieve. However, if you're giving pre-dilution, although you are decreasing the hemoconcentration, you will decrease the efficiency of what you're trying to do because you're diluting the solutes that you want to remove from the patient. So the urea or the creatinine and all the uremic toxins will get to the blood pump. You're going to dilute them by whatever the replacement fluid rate will be in relation to plasma flow. And as a consequence of that, the system will be less efficient. Now, this effect is going to be dependent on plasma flow. If you're having, for example, 2 liters or 33.3 mils of replacement fluid coming before the filter, and your blood flow, for example, is 150 mils, then your plasma flow is likely to be about 100 mils. So your dilution of the solutes will be about 30%. On the other hand, if your blood flow was 250 mils and your hematocrit was 30%, then the plasma flow will be a lot higher than before, and so the dilutional effect of pre-dilution will be less. So the efficiency loss of the system is going to be dependent on your blood flow. So this is the example. You've got hematocrit of 30%, the plasma flow is 100 mils. You've got an effluent flow rate of 33.3 mils per minute. If you give pre-dilution at a zero balance CRT and you deliver the pre-dilution before the pump, then you will decrease the sodium concentration by 20%. And of course, if you increase the blood flow, that will increase your efficiency of therapy. So some of you might say, oh yeah, no, I don't want to decrease efficiency. I'm a kind of an efficient kind of guy, so Italians wouldn't worry about that, right? So I'm an efficient kind of guy. I'm from Germany, and I want to do it efficiently. And so I'm going to move to post-dilution instead. But of course, this will lead to hemoconcentration, because just imagine the blood's coming in, the plasma's coming in, and now you're filtering. And so the concentration, for example, of hemoglobin or clotting factors or platelets at the end of the filter will increase by about 20%, depending again on what your blood flow is, because you're removing all this plasma water. And so if you do that, there will be a surge of all of these factors, and logically, you would expect that having this hemoconcentration will contribute to decreased filter life. And of course, just like before, that degree of hemoconcentration will depend on your blood flow, which will dictate your plasma flow, which will dictate the relationship between plasma water removal and plasma. So that's going to happen. Now, post-dilution will preserve the efficiency because it will not dilute the solutes you want to remove. And this is an example. So you've got the same blood flow. Now the hematocrit is 30%. The plasma flow will be 100 mils. Same effluent rate. And you that by the end of the filter, the plasma water will be removed, the hematocrit, the platelet concentration, the clotting factor concentration, everything will be increased by about 20%. And this efficiency is preserved, but the risk of clotting is increased. And of course, if you increase the blood flow, that hemoconcentration proportionately will be decreased. All right. Well, when we combine the two, like if you're kind of a Hamletic kind of person, to pre-dilute or not to pre-dilute, that is the question. And so then you could mix it up and give half of the treatment replacement, pre-dilution and post-dilution. And of course, logically, that's going to be halfway. So you will attenuate the surge in hematocrit, but you will lose some of the efficiency, but you lose half of the efficiency because you're only doing half of the replacement system pre-filter. But of course, this is a more complex system because now you're delivering the replacement fluid into different places. So some of you will say, look, just be done with this. This is too many calculations, and let's just move on and just do continuous veno-venous hemodialysis and just cut all this nonsense. That's reasonable. You will not require high blood flows because the plasma flow, even at a blood flow of 100 mils a minute, which really isn't much, the plasma flow will always exceed the dialysate flow because you're doing slow therapy with CRRT. So if you got a hematocrit of 30%, your plasma flow will be 70 mils a minute. And there will be full equilibration of solutes, similar to doing post-dilution CVVH. But, of course, if you do that, for small solutes, the clearance will be pretty much the same as post-dilution CVVH. But you're going to get diffusive clearance. And diffusive clearance is different from convective clearance, particularly for middle molecules. So a variety of middle molecules will not be cleared in the same way by doing CRRT in CVVHD format as they would be cleared if you did it in CVVH modality. Who cares? Somebody might say, I don't care. Who cares about middle molecules? Well, that's a good question. John Kellum tried to address this some time ago and looked at a group of patients having CVVHD versus CVVH. And he looked at a concentration of a variety of cytokines at the start and during therapy. And he was able to show that if you look at the square ones, which are the CVVHD patients, there was an increase in the time-weighted concentration of these, of TNF in this particular case, with CVVHD, but this did not happen with CVVH. Now, whether it's membrane adsorption or whether it's a little bit of clearance or a combination of both, but there was a statistically significant difference in the effect of these two modalities of TNF. Of course, this is a potential biological difference, and the clinical meaning of that is unknown. So there was a biological difference. That's interesting. But even the physiological effect of that, let alone the clinical effect of that, remain unclear. So if you're a compromising kind of soul, you might just look, oh, okay, there is the CVVH stuff and the pre-dilution stuff and the post-dilution stuff and the CVVHD. Look, I'm going to sit in the middle. I'm going to combine convection and diffusion, and I'm going to do continuous veno-venous hemodiafiltration. And this system is where there is a combination of convective clearance, which can be regulated. It can be 50%, 30%, as you might wish, of course. You've got all the choices, with dialysate flow. So it combines diffusion and convection. The setup is a bit more complex. And of course, the clearance is going to depend on how much pre-dilution you do again, because if you've got a diffusive component that can only clear the solutes according to the concentration that exists in the plasma that's entering the filter. So if you're doing some pre-dilution in CVVHDF, you're going to decrease the efficiency of the D component of what you're doing. So again, you have all sorts of choices that can modulate that side of the pre-dilution and the diffusion and how much is convective and how much is diffusive. But this was the technique that was used in ATN and renal. And it was a technique that was used not because we thought that was the ideal or perfect or optimal modality, but because it made it technically easy and possible to deliver high and low dose without modifying the clearances due to the design of the modality. So there's quite a menu, quite a combination. So if you're the sort of person who says, look, I'm not sure what I should do, but I better do what everyone else does, so I will not be criticized, that's a good policy. So we try to find out what the world did in the Best Kidney Study. This is a study that involved 54 units in 23 countries and more than 1,000 patients, where we try to understand the practice of renal replacement therapy in the form of CRRT. And you can see there that there is a distribution, at least at that time, which is now about 10 years ago, in favor of CVVH. So that's participating centers at that time were doing convective therapy in preference, mixed therapy is 34%, and CVVHD was less frequent. And some people couldn't afford a pump, which is interesting. And what about pre-dilution and post-dilution? You can see that pre-dilution was dominant over post-dilution, but it wasn't far from 50-50, which is kind of what you'd expect, I guess. But post-dilution was so pre-dilution was the dominant approach if renal replacement therapy was given. So this gave us the opportunity to ask the question, does it matter? Is there any association between the modality of CRT that you've chosen and the patient outcome? And when you look at all the variables that were associated with patient outcome, the modality was not associated with patient outcome, suggesting that it doesn't matter. I said before that if you do pre-dilution, you're going to decrease the efficiency of the system, but you might prevent hemoconcentration. If you prevented hemoconcentration, you might prevent filter clotting. You might decrease the risk of filter clotting. If you did that, then the downtime, the time that you have when there is no filter on, might also decrease. So even though you've lost efficiency when you're doing the treatment, because the filters clot less, the overall delivery of therapy might actually be the same. And it might not be different, but it would cost you less because fewer filters would clot. And we tried to do a pre and post study in critically ill patients, not a very large study, but it was a proof of concept investigation. And we compare patients in the pre-dilution CVVH mode and after we switched over to post-dilution. It's about 200 filters in the pre-dilution period versus 107 filters in the post-dilution period. And we looked at what happened to these two groups. And you can see that filter life was different. And post-dilution was associated in this study with a shorter filter life compared to pre-dilution. And when you do a multivariate logistic regression analysis to look at the factors associated with filter life, you found that pre-dilution was independently associated with longer filter life. And if you looked at the uremic control or azotemic control in these two groups of patients, it was the same. So if you do pre-dilution CVVH on the basis of this study, rather than post-dilution CVVH, you save filters and your azotemic control is as good as with post-dilution. So, should we do randomized control trials comparing these two types of treatments and looking at clinical difference? And Sean did the Omaki study in Canada to try and compare whether there was a difference in terms of clinical outcomes between diffusive and convective therapy. This is a phase 2 study. Patients were allocated to CVVH or CVVHD randomly. This is the description of the type of population. And as you can see, there is a reasonable degree of balance between the two groups, as you would expect from a randomized study. The duration of RT prescribed and the solution flow, the post-replacement solution flow, the prescribed dose, delivery, and so on are presented and are equivalent. Now, the clinical outcome for this study was to see if there was a change in sequential organ failure assessment score when comparing CVVH and CVVHD. Within the limitations of a small phase 2 study, there was really no significant signal there in favor of one modality versus the other, which has some utility for clinicians because it suggests that convective therapy at a clinical level is not that much better or not that much more important or not that much more valuable than diffusive therapy. And so then the group went on to look at the systematic review. What do we know about the literature? And this is a wonderfully Canadian-style systematic review, which is the Canadians always do systematic reviews. It snows a lot in Canada, and they're never outdoors. So what can you do? You do systematic reviews. And so they do it very, very well, very comprehensively. And this is one of them, and it was able to look at a variety of outcomes. And this is an assessment of the effect of hemofiltration versus hemodialysis, CVVH versus CVHD, on mortality. And you can see there is no significant signal there. But it is of interest that when they were able to compare the effect of hemofiltration versus hemodialysis, there was a signal in favor of a shorter filter, like against, if you wish, CVVH, with a shorter filter life with convective therapy versus diffusive therapy. Now, there was also a signal, as you would expect, that if you were doing convective therapy, there was greater clearance of middle molecules, as in particular case here, using beta-2 microglobulin as a marker of middle molecules. And this confirms what we know, that CVVHD with diffusive therapy will not be a good therapy for middle molecular removal, but it's gentler on the filter because it doesn't have the convective component, and therefore it's likely to be associated with longer filter life. What do we know about the distribution of management on the systematic review? That's very regional. You can see there, depending on whether you are in Canada, where everybody is very keen to report doing CVVH-DF, or whether you are in the UK, where people are more likely to do CVVH. This is regional behavior, which is based on imponderable and unmeasurable variables that no one will ever understand, but there you go. So the Canadians want to do trade, and the British want to become an island again. That's how it works. So we thought the time was ripe to do an interesting study, because we now have the ability to download colossal amounts of data from the back of the machines about all sorts of aspects of what goes on when we do CRRT. And we decided to do a switch. So we're operating in a teaching hospital with CVVH-DF, and we decided to swap and move to CVVHD. And we decided to look at circuits that had a short filter life, what we call acute kidney failure or artificial kidney failure, and intermediate filter life and late filter life, and look at these two modalities in comparison. You can see that the kind of patients and the kind of filter lives we saw were very similar. When we looked at whether there was a difference in access and the effect between CVVH-DF and CVVHD, we didn't really see any significant signal there. But of course, there was a difference in the hemodynamics of the circuit, and that's inevitable. So when you're doing CVVHD, you are going to have lower blood flow because you don't need a higher blood flow. And so you're not going to ask the double lumen access catheter to give you 230 mils that you might ask of the catheter in order to maintain efficiency and avoid hemoconcentration, because you're doing diffusive clearance. All right? So it's not a surprise that, of course, the blood flow is less, the transmembrane pressure is less because there is less blood flow, not a surprise there, and of course, the access outflow pressure, the negative pressure that you're applying to the double lumen catheter to get the blood to flow into the filter will obviously be less. And I think this is, and I'll show you why this is important, because you're asking less of the catheter. You're demanding less of the catheter. And when you look at it, overall mean circuit life was not different between the two treatments. However, when you look at subgroups of circuits that experience early artificial kidney failure, you can see that there is a bit of a signal there. There is a longer filter life for such short-living filters, possibly because you're testing the access less. You're asking less of the access. What is particularly interesting when you summarize the data is that if you got low blood flow, CVVHD, compared to higher blood flow, CVVHDF, you have a longer treatment time in filters that tend to fail early. As you would expect, the access pressure that you have to apply to the catheter is less negative and also has less variability in CVVH. It doesn't swing as much. And of course, the return pressure is less positive. The transmembrane pressure is obviously much higher in CVHDF because the blood flow is almost twice as much, and it shouldn't surprise you. Early access dysfunction appears to be less if you're doing CVVHD. But this is the cool thing. We just love this. You can download the alarms from the machine. I never realized how diabolical the number of alarms would be. So if you're operating CVHDF, every 9 minutes and 20 seconds, the machine will alarm. Now, it's potentially because the patient has moved, or the patient has coughed, or the patient has sneezed, or the patient has been turned, or the bed has been modified, the patient has been set up. Whatever the reason, every 9 minutes, 20 seconds. That's amazing. If you do CVVHD, on the other hand, you change that to every 20 minutes and 20 seconds. This is like thousands of data points, right? And if you're operating in circuits that fail quickly, you actually have half the number of alarms with CVVHD. So let me conclude by saying that there are several modalities of CRT. They are based on different principles of solute removal, diffusion or convection, or a mixture of the two. These differences, as I hope I have clarified for you, have implications for clearance and efficiency overall, and comparing convection to diffusion for middle molecules, and comparing pre-dilution to post-dilution for hemoconcentration. There is only limited quality of data available, but the data that are available, as systematically reviewed by Sean, show that there is better life for CVVHD compared to CVVH. And the data that I presented from our group suggests that there is better filter life with pre-dilution versus post-dilution. These two differences are not based on high-level perfect data, but are totally logical. They fit in with totally logical expectations. And people need to understand these principles and these logical inferences in order to make rational choices about the kind of CRT modality that is best for your unit. Thank you very much.